Since Ocarina of Time, our aim has always been to produce something different, something you've never seen before in a video game. With Zelda, we're always trying to do something unique. I think this, and the fact that we continue to push ourselves to come up with new ideas for each title, has kept the series fresh over the years. Innovation. That is what the Zelda series is all about, at least as far as the developers are concerned. Innovation is at the core of their identity as a franchise, and it's hard to say they're wrong. Entire genres of games have been built off the backs of Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild, but I'm gonna go against the grain and say that it's not enough. They try to innovate with every single game in the series, which is admirable. But at the same time, I feel like they're focusing all of their innovation in the wrong areas. As a result, the series has been growing stagnant. If Aonuma really wants to show us something we haven't seen before, the Zelda team needs to take a long, hard look at their innovation process. And actually, while we're here, why don't we take a look at their innovation process? I've been perusing developer interviews, and it turns out that every Zelda game starts the exact same way, creating some kind of basic gimmick. Director Fujibayashi, the guy in charge of Minish Cap, and also Phantom Hourglass and Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, said this: in addition to puzzles and action, Zelda games need some kind of gameplay gimmick. We have to find that something extra. In the case of Minish Cap, their big idea was to make Link shrink. Link is just a little guy. He can explore bookshelves and fight bugs. The entire game is based on this one concept. And without this gimmick, well, they would have come up with something. Maybe a game where Link turns purple. That would be cool. Each game needs to bring something new to the table, otherwise they're no better than Mario. The gimmick is where the gameplay begins, and the entire game world is meant to flow through this new concept. Making the action structure and the interaction elements becomes the starting point for everything else. Once those things are done, things rapidly start branching out. The Zelda team has a very specific idea of what innovation is supposed to look like. Call it core gameplay, call it mechanics, but it really is just coding. They want their core gameplay to feel fun, unique, and most importantly, different from every other game. This is their top priority, the thing that comes before everything else. And, in my opinion, it comes at the expense of everything else. But we'll get to that later. In an interview about Twilight Princess, Iwata notes, "The storyline of Zelda is created to bring out the best of the fun and interesting gameplay elements, in such a way that the consistency of the story is maintained." Another developer comments, "Each time a new and interesting gameplay element is devised, something is later added to the story to accommodate it. This is how it always goes. Game mechanic first, then add story." Here are a few major examples that show you just how deep this goes. Skyward Sword. There was an idea for a boomerang that could be controlled with the Wii Motion Plus, and this idea eventually evolved into the Beetle item, which could fly around and pick stuff up. But you can't just have a mechanical beetle lying around, that's gonna break the player's fantasy. So they created this ancient advanced civilization to give the item some backstory. This ancient civilization ended up becoming the context for all of Linearu's gameplay. The item and its design came first. Everything else was created to justify it. Twilight Princess. Early in development, Aonuma wanted to shake up the series a little bit, so he suggested what would later become Link's most iconic transformation. He wasn't even being that serious at the time, he was just trying to get the ball rolling. The idea stuck though, and as they tested out new models, Miyamoto commented that the new Link looked a little boring from the back. He suggested someone ride on Link's back so as to create a more dynamic image for the player to look at, and that's where Midna was born. You know, the Twilight Princess from Twilight Princess. She only exists to keep Link from barebacking his way through Hyrule, or raw-dogging his way through Hyrule, whichever joke makes more sense. Echoes of Wisdom is a more recent example. Once they settled on the idea of summoning echoes as a core gameplay feature, they worried that the players would instinctively rely on Link's sword and shield combat, rather than experimenting with their new tools. Their solution, as you've probably already guessed, was to make Zelda the central character. Zelda finally got her own game, not because the devs wanted to build a story around her, but because Zelda, rather than Link, fit their vision for the gameplay. Of course, the most egregious example is the Zoni from Tears of the Kingdom. The Zoni devices were originally Sheikah flavored, but at one point the devs decided to pivot to a new aesthetic. But if the Sheikah didn't make all this tech, then who did? Well, there's gotta be some other ancient advanced civilization to justify these new mechanics. And, well, Breath of the Wild vaguely mentions the ancient Zoni, so the devs took that name and made it the basis for their new Zoni-based story. But I hear you ask, what Zoni-based story? There were like 2 Zoni in this game, and we learned nothing about their civilization. The aesthetics don't even line up with what we thought we knew about them from Breath of the Wild. And to that I say, yeah, exactly. That's sort of the problem with the Zelda team's approach. On its own, commitment to gameplay is commendable. Games with bad or boring game mechanics are Danganronpa at best, or Balan Wonderworld at worst. But at times it seems like the Zelda team forgets that there's more to a game than just mechanics. Before A Link Between Worlds was even a glimmer in the developers' eyes, they pitched an idea for a Zelda game with a theme of communication. This idea was shot down by Miyamoto, who said it sounds like an idea that's 20 years old, or 10 years too early. Mario and Luigi Brothers Ship came out last year, and it's all about bringing people together. That's the same thing. Later, they came up with the idea of Link merging into walls, a mechanic that fully showed off the capabilities of the 3DS with its shifting camera angles. When Miyamoto approved this idea, they decided to combine the wall merging with another one of Miyamoto's suggestions, revisiting the world of A Link to the Past. These ideas go together like Squid Game and pizza, which is to say, there's no thematic synergy, but it's probably fine, right? Let's not read too much into it. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this game is bad for clout. A Link Between Worlds is pretty universally seen as the most solid entry we've had in a long time. But then, the game is also a very standard Zelda game. Perhaps the most standard Zelda since Ocarina of Time. Remember how the original idea for this game was a theme of communication that was shot down by Miyamoto? Now Miyamoto, I'm talking to you, Miyamoto. You scrapped the idea because it felt old and uninteresting. So tell me, Miyamoto, what is the theme of A Link Between Worlds? You know, the big idea that must have replaced the theme of communication. I'm sure you can come up with something, but it's 10 years too late for that. One reviewer, trying to do your job for you, described this game as Link being caught between the 2D and the 3D worlds, which I suppose is a bit of meta-commentary on the Zelda series as a whole. But that feels more symbolic than anything else. It's not part of the actual story. Truthfully, this game does not have a unique theme, or even unique story moments. It's a traditional Zelda game where you explore dungeons and fight monsters. And I want to reiterate, this was a good game. The gimmick was innovative, the dungeons were interesting, the puzzles were well made. But that same reviewer from earlier said something that feels kind of sad in retrospect. A Link Between Worlds is not a total revolution, but it may very well be the start of one. Aonuma said that the Zelda series is all about giving us something we've never seen before, but outside of the wall gimmick, this game is very, very much what we've seen before. Like, it's explicitly a link to the past with a new coat of paint, and some rad new paintings, I suppose. It was good, but not revolutionary. However, it felt like it could be the start of something. Like it was laying down the groundwork for a brilliant resurgence in 2D Zelda games. This one was pretty standard, but surely it will only get better from here. Like, all they have to do is build on what made this game great, and the next one will be phenomenal. So, where will the next game take us? What grand adventures await? A Link Between Worlds came out in 2013. 2 years later, we get Triforce Heroes, a fun but entirely separate take on the Zelda series, with multiplayer dungeons and almost no story to speak of. It's part of the Zelda timeline, but let's be honest, you haven't played this game. I would recommend it, except, well, you need friends to play it with. 2 friends, exactly, and they each need a console to play it on. Unfortunately, the only people who still have a 3DS lying around are sad adults with full-time jobs, which makes it impossible to schedule, because get this, the 3DS servers are down, which means you have to play this game in person, or play by yourself in boring mode. Fun game, but if you're not already part of a 3-man polycule, good luck actually finding a chance to play it. Anyway, after Triforce Heroes, we wait until 2019 to get a remake of Link's Awakening. Fun fact, this game only came about because the Zelda team wanted to create a Dungeon Maker feature, where the player could set down chambers and experiment with the layouts of dungeons. Meanwhile, the dungeons in Link's Awakening have a lot of very similarly sized rooms, which makes it a perfect match for the Dungeon Maker feature they dreamed up. How do these two ideas build on each other? They don't. There's no real thematic connection between the story of Link's Awakening and the process of building dungeons. It just sort of happened, like Squid Game on a pizza. They couldn't just remake a 2D Zelda game, they had to tie in some gimmick to justify it. And it doesn't get better either. The first proper 2D Zelda game since A Link Between Worlds was released in 2024, with an over 10-year gap between the two. We'll talk more about Echoes of Wisdom later, and also earlier, but for now I think it's safe to say that A Link Between Worlds did not, in fact, start a revolution. But why not? Why did this game have to be a one-and-done wonder? Did the Zelda team just lose interest? Are they stupid? I don't think that's quite it. The Zelda team couldn't just build on A Link Between Worlds, they had to innovate. They had to create something different. 3-player Zelda, Dungeon Builder! Instead of building on the strong foundation of their best games, they have to go reinventing the wheel every single time. And this exclusive focus on mechanics is why every mainline Zelda game ends up feeling more or less the same. Breath of the Wild, for example. The physics are tight, the gameplay is fun, but when the entire game is focused on these mechanics, it runs the risk of feeling a little bit shallow. I loved this game. A lot of people loved this game, but there's the common sentiment that the world felt like a massive tech demo. Like, this game was good, but the next one will really knock our socks off. And then it's Tears of the Kingdom. Look, this channel is a safe space for Tears of the Kingdom fans. I like Tears of the Kingdom. I fight for Tears of the Kingdom. But this is the part where famous Tears of the Kingdom liker Hayato Sensei Dark has to acknowledge some of the game's flaws. First of all, is it innovative? From a technical perspective, yes, absolutely. Ascend, Ultra Hand, and the Zoni devices are all mind-blowing. These are things we've never seen before, but unlike every other gameplay innovation in the Zelda series, they did not build Tears of the Kingdom around these mechanics. This game is built on top of the Hyrule from Breath of the Wild, which in turn was built around climbing and gliding, not ascending and driving. Meanwhile, the Zoni devices and Ultra Hand can be used anywhere, but the world isn't really built for them either. Yeah, there are shrines, Addison signs, and escort missions.
I thought I made it clear that I'm not in need of an escort.
But these are scattered around a map that was not built for Ultra Hand. Take the Great Sky Island, for example. Here you're building bridges, elevators, and boats. But once you get to Hyrule, there's no place where it makes sense to do something like that. A lot of Sky Islands are built around Ultra Hand and Zoni devices, but these are entirely separate from the surface of Hyrule, so the gameplay doesn't have that level of cohesion that we've come to expect from the Zelda series. And you know, the game really wants you to use Zoni contraptions in combat. Like, in theory, it's a really fun idea, but the enemies and encounters in this game are not built for this kind of hefty machinery. If the Zoni devices had been the basis of a fresh game, they would have built combat encounters with the assumption that you would be using the game's core mechanics. Instead, we get to watch the Zoni device do the fighting for us, and then drag it along with us to the next fight. This actually proves the Zelda team right to an extent. If they'd done their usual pattern of gameplay first, story second, they could have built the entire world around these Zoni devices. But since they tacked the gimmick onto an already existing world, it comes across more as an afterthought. So on the one hand, yes, it's innovative, but those innovations don't necessarily carry as much weight as they could. Ascend, Ultra Hand, these abilities are incredible, but I have to admit that these abilities deserved a game of their own, a world where bridges and boats are tools you can rely on for your entire playthrough. Instead, we got the world of Breath of the Wild a second time, and while I thought it was an interesting experiment with nostalgia, this game really does reflect the stagnation the series has been dealing with. This Hyrule is fundamentally something we've seen before. We're still in Hyrule, we're still looking for Zelda. An ancient evil is reawakened and we have to draw on the power of an ancient civilization to fight against it. Yes, there are a lot of things that help Tears of the Kingdom stand apart from its predecessor, but I don't blame anyone for saying that this game is just a copy-paste of Breath of the Wild. But I think a lot of Zelda games have this problem to some extent. The evil Ganon has returned, darkness is spreading across the land, go to each dungeon, collect the MacGuffin, save the princess. Most Zelda games follow the exact same story beats without too much deviation, and I think this is where the stagnation comes in. While the Zelda team is spending all of their time innovating on a new mechanic, they're not giving nearly as much attention to the rest of the game. They want each gimmick to give us a new way to look at the world, but what we really need is a world worth looking at. What they don't realize is that the mechanics aren't what make a game memorable, it's the story and the atmosphere that stick with us. Let's talk about Majora's Mask for a second. Majora's Mask brings a couple of new things to the table. Firstly, Link can use masks to transform. This breathes new life into the stale Ocarina of Time gameplay, letting you swim, shoot bubbles, roll around. But you already know that this is not the main reason people talk about Majora's Mask. No, the main gimmick is the falling moon, the unavoidable tragedy looming over the entire game. Termina is a doomed world, and at every corner the player is faced with themes of loss and death. There's no princess to save, no Triforce. You're bringing together giants to catch the falling moon before it kills everyone. And man, it feels different. 2 years later, we get Wind Waker, another deliciously distinct entry for the series. But it takes the feeling of adventure in a whole new direction, focusing on the freedom of the open seas. This is another completely unique experience that relies less on mechanics and more on atmosphere and environmental storytelling. Both of these games came out within 5 years of Ocarina of Time, the most defining game in the series, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Ocarina of Time laid a really strong groundwork, but the Zelda team knew that each game ought to stand on its own. So they made Majora's Mask and Wind Waker to feature worlds completely unlike what we'd seen before. The gameplay is fun, but the adventure is what we remember. And adventure, it seems, was the main idea going into Twilight Princess. We know from interviews that they were trying to recapture some of the atmosphere from Ocarina of Time, but they didn't just slap a dog into a game and call it a day. No, the whole Twilight realm, as it spreads darkness across Hyrule, carries its own unique sense of dread. Different from the doom of Majora's Mask, but disturbing in its own way. On top of that, they wanted Twilight Princess to be the biggest Zelda game they'd ever made. So instead of just doing Ocarina of Time again, they did Ocarina of Time but better. Not only is each dungeon unique, but they made an effort to more closely incorporate these dungeons as part of the world. Gorons use the Goron mines. The Arbiter's grounds are where Ganondorf was sealed away. My OTP lives in Snow Peak ruins. These places have a clear purpose outside of just housing a MacGuffin. Beyond the dungeons, Twilight Princess treats us to some real tasty story beats. There's that horseback brawl to save Colin. There's a western standoff in the Hidden Village. And you see the whole Zora population frozen in ice. Diverse, unique moments that make Twilight Princess feel like an adventure. Something different. Something we hadn't seen before. As a whole, this game is unashamedly the successor to Ocarina of Time, but it's juggling so many interesting story beats that it feels like the series is actually doing something fresh. The Coyote sections, well, I've seen differing opinions on these. They're supposed to be the selling point of the game, but I think they're just fine. Coyote Link has his moments, sure, but Coyote mode doesn't add all that much to the puzzles or story. Even the Coyote combat is lackluster, as Coyote Link has his entire toolkit locked in from the very beginning. He doesn't gain new abilities as you progress, so this gimmick can wear thin pretty quickly. I wouldn't say this detracts from the game, but to me it shows that the Zelda team's innovative gimmicks just aren't as important as innovative storytelling. Unfortunately, Skyward Sword is the game where the gimmicks completely overshadow the rest of the story. There are a lot of cool elements here, but the main innovation of this game is the motion-controlled swordplay. This concept is so integral to the game's identity that the Zelda team decided to build the entire story around that sword, giving it a personality of sorts, and making the plot about forging it into a stronger blade, which, incidentally, is something we've seen before. Wind Waker, Minish Cap. This game has other interesting ideas, but they kind of fall by the wayside. Skyloft is a really cool location, but the actual adventure is on the surface. And the surface has, what, 3 biomes? That's barely more than the depths from Tears of the Kingdom. Zelda is your childhood friend, but that doesn't really matter because Zelda isn't in this game. Also, we've seen this exact plot point before. Also in Minish Cap. Is that what Fujibayashi's doing? Trying to remake Minish Cap under our noses? Riding the Loftwing is fun, but outside of one race and one boss fight, it's just a boat with extra steps. We've got the Kikwis, a plant-themed race of little guys who guide you to the forest dungeon, and we have the Mole Men. I don't know, is that something? Like I said before, cool mechanics aren't enough to reach a game's full potential. Skyward Sword has a lot of really cool ideas when it comes to the dungeons and the boss fights, but this game's fundamental identity is, unfortunately, very generic. And that brings us around to Breath of the Wild. 120 shrines featuring puzzles and combat challenges, 4 divine beasts, robotic dungeons that can be physically manipulated to solve puzzles, one massive sandbox to explore. I don't need to explain to you that Breath of the Wild is the most innovative Zelda since Ocarina of Time. It's an open world game with a smooth combat system that feels so good to play. But the plot? It feels about as simple as it can get without sacrificing quality. I mentioned earlier that some people see Breath of the Wild as an overglorified tech demo, and that's because there's one storyline that happens 4 times. You find out that a divine beast is causing trouble for the locals, so you team up with some important figure from their city to disable the divine beast's shields. Once you've created an opening, you board the divine beast, solve some puzzles, and defeat a blight. Rinse and repeat for each region. There's nuance to it, of course. One quest features Yunobo, who's, well... while boarding Vah Ruta is perhaps the only way I could ever enjoy riding a man. Each champion has a unique relationship to Link, and honestly, it's the emotional core of the story. But again, the plot is simple. It's almost entirely hidden behind optional flashbacks. It's clear that the years spent making this game were focused on gameplay and exploration. There's not much enemy variety, there's a lack of progression, and there are very few truly memorable moments. The developers saw this as giving the player a chance to create their own story, but I don't think I'm alone in saying that they could have done a lot more. But no. When they made Breath of the Wild, they were focused on fresh gameplay, and by the Golden Goddesses, they were gonna give us some fresh gameplay. The worst part is they're still behaving this way. Their most recent game is Echoes of Wisdom, and while it's a very fun game with some cute characters, it's clear that their focus was, once again, on the game mechanics before everything else. The Link's Awakening chamber dungeons were just a prototype. What the team really wanted to do was make an involved dungeon builder, a true Mario Maker for Zelda, where the player could collect enemies and objects to set down in their own personalized dungeons. But after a year of developing this idea, they decided to pivot into a more traditional 2D Zelda game, featuring the ecosystem we are now familiar with. What's shocking to me, though, is how long it took them to come up with an actual plot. Summer 2023. They spent 9 days hashing out a story. Not even 2 weeks. If my math is correct, that would be, 3 years into development? More importantly, this was only 1 year before the game's 2024 release. And let's talk about those 9 days of plot development. They had a boot camp to work it all out. Aonuma wrote a script overnight. Then we all contributed various elements that often occur in the Legend of Zelda series to the script. Using this method, we eventually completed the game's story. 9 days of recycled Zelda concepts? I'm shocked that this game turned out as well as it did. Each storyline in this game is pretty simple, never bad, and while it's not a direct copy and paste of what we've seen before, I can't exactly call this version of Hyrule innovative. Like, what new thing are we supposed to latch onto? The insecure Goron chief who's just Yunobo but better? The Deku scrubs that are selling smoothies? The Gerudo being exactly the same as they were in the last game? Look, I loved Conde, but I'm kind of like a brother to him in the sense that I finished the game and I left him behind. No, the big innovation, the one thing that everyone will remember about this game, was playing as Girl Zelda. Which is cool and good, but outside of Girl Zelda, what's the draw of this game? Oh, right, the echoes, the main gimmick. But game mechanics come and go. They're just one part of the total gameplay experience. A lot of people have said that Echoes of Wisdom is a step in the right direction, but I disagree. I think it's a great game that stands on its own, but if we're taking steps, I think Echoes of Wisdom is taking us in the wrong direction. Yes, it has the classic style of dungeons that we've all been craving, but I don't think it's worth it. Not if the Zelda team keeps refusing to push a more interesting story. But the story isn't the point of Echoes of Wisdom, which brings us back around to the point of this video. The Zelda team keeps on innovating with core gameplay mechanics, but they've been getting lazy with everything else. Story, world, atmosphere. For the past 3 console generations, it seems like the Zelda team has been losing sight of these critical elements that give Zelda games their soul. They want to give us something we haven't seen before, but when they only care about the game mechanics, we're gonna get stuck in this vicious cycle of, wow, that was a cool tech demo, I can't wait to see how they build on it in the next game. It'll always feel like the start of a revolution, but we'll never get to see it through to its resolution. What is this, some kind of Zelda cycle? And I want to clarify, All of these games have been pretty good. Any one of these games could stand on its own as a fantastic and memorable introduction to the Zelda series. But when we look at the bigger picture, the Zelda series is slowly becoming a monolith of the same few elements repeated ad nauseum. The world of Zelda deserves more than just standard Hyrule every time. Sure, change up the gameplay, but don't let that be where your creativity ends. Alright, it's time to talk about Tears of the Kingdom again. I'll be saying nice things this time, so if that bothers you, I'm sorry. You can skip ahead if you want to, I'll understand. Are they gone? Alright, every Zelda game has some really good story beats mixed in, but I think Tears of the Kingdom has some really exceptional high points that hopefully foreshadow the direction this series might be going in. Firstly, we have the Stormwind arc. Anticipation builds as you make your way to the giant storm cloud in the sky. The music swells as you rise through the winds, until finally you find yourself above the clouds. Then from above you drop down on the legendary flying ship. Once you've completed the dungeon, you get to fight Colgera, one of the coolest bosses of all time. This fight has the best mobility in any Zelda game, with Link utilizing the updraft to navigate the arena and dive straight through the heart of the beast. It is something we've never seen before in a Zelda game. Secondly, the zombie invasion. Wandering through the sandstorm to approach the city, you'll likely encounter one or two Gibdos, weird zombie-like creatures that seem almost indestructible. Eventually you find out they're weak to elemental damage, and then you have to fight a whole horde of them as they approach Gerudo Town from all sides. You have to think tactically and move quickly, making full use of your elemental inventory to drive them off. Once again, something we've never seen before in a Zelda game. Finally, let's talk about the final boss of this game.
Ganondorf
Puts up a fight, dealing permanent damage with his gloom attacks and using the same flurry dodge we've been using for the past 2 games. But once we defeat him, Secret Stone, Demon King, he turns into a dragon, and the fight makes its way into the skies. Light Dragon versus Dark Dragon, completing the Ouroboros motif that's come to define this game. And then, when the fight is over, Link dives through the sky, reaching out to grab Zelda, a direct parallel to the beginning of the game. It is incredible. The thing is, I have seen all of this before, but not in a Zelda game. It's not the first time there's ever been a flying boat. It's not the first time someone's fought a horde of zombies. It's not even the first time I've seen this kind of skydiving sequence. But these elements feel fresh because they're new to Zelda. And I think that's the key to what we really want to see moving forward. The Zelda series has always been innovative with its mechanics and gameplay, but it's always at its best when it's giving us an adventure. And that means taking us into unfamiliar territory. Majora's Mask and Spirit Tracks each took just a couple of years of development, and that forced their developers to get more creative with the kind of story they were telling. Rather than reinventing the gameplay from the ground up, they found new ways to innovate. And I'm not saying I want them to rush out imperfect products, but I do wish they were more willing to compromise. If you have solid gameplay, you don't need to build a new physics system. Funnel that innovation into the rest of your story. Video games are more than just a bundle of mechanics wrapped around a physics engine. Zelda games especially are supposed to evoke a sense of adventure. That's where they need to start. How can they take the players on a new adventure? Show them a world they've never seen before. Gimmicks are fun, but they're not worth eating up years and years of development time. If the series wants to move forward, it needs to acknowledge that innovation isn't just about impressive lines of code. Innovation is about leaving behind the standard conventions the series has come to rely on and forging a story that will redefine what Zelda can be. Breath of the Wild bucked quite a few trends, changed up the gameplay formula, but it still gave us a very standard version of Hyrule. And given that they've shown no signs of stopping, it looks like this is the direction they want to keep going in. But who knows? Each time they start development on a new Zelda game, they're giving themselves another chance to innovate, to give us something we've never seen before. Rather than challenging themselves to make the next big innovation in gaming, maybe they'll challenge themselves to give us the next big innovation in Zelda. We don't need complex new mechanics. We just want adventure. Something new. Something we've never seen before. And that is why a crossover with Sonic the Hedgehog is the only way for the Zelda series to finally move out of its shell. In this essay, I will be